Adrienne Rich gives us a pretty good understanding of what compulsory heterosexuality looks like, and we'll be going through that in this video. So this idea is that there's this assumption that all women are naturally inclined towards men or are gay because they're acting out of bitterness towards men. These are common understandings. And we see this even today. This is not just a thing that's happening in 1980. If lesbians will commonly report the phenomena of hearing, you just haven't had the right dick, which is supposed to mean that somehow deep down lesbians are really straight, and that what they need is just the right guy or the right person to get them to turn back to straight, quote unquote. So she wants to ask why in the history of at least academic work or political work, historical work, why have lesbians been crushed? Why have we been forced into hiding and disguise or neglected, including in feminism? And none of the examples that she considers is the idea that women would choose heterosexual coupling and marriage raised. So she considers a couple different works and investigates them. So here's just some examples of those. There's a book that's about giving women advice by male health professionals, but most of those comments are geared towards the role capitalism and patriarchy assigned for women, and rarely are the health professional suggestions scientific or women-oriented. There's no depiction of the general prescription against lesbianism, despite the fact that, they should know better. In a feminist work on a new psychology of women, it's written as if lesbians simply don't exist. In the work Mermaid and the Minotaur, this idea of male-female symbiosis of gender arrangements, are construed as leading the species into this violent and self-extinction. That's the feminist critique. But the author sees women and men as equal partners in the making of sexual arrangements, and thus ignores spinsters, marriage resistors, witches, autonomous widows, femmes sous, I think that's how you pronounce that, and lesbians. And what Rich wants to point out is that feminists have really a lot to learn from these kinds of women. She says, quote, the fact is that women in every culture and throughout history have undertaken the task of independent, non-heterosexual, women-connected existence to the extent made possible by their context, often in the belief that they were the only ones ever to have done so. And this is in large part because of an erasure of lesbian existence. And Rich wants to say that this is in favor and support of heterosexual patriarchal interests. She points out Chodorov's discussion of psychology, saying that Chodorov fails to analyze how constraints and sanctions have enforced or ensured the coupling of women with men. So, for example, witch burnings, male control of law, theology, science, economic non-viability. So that's the idea that women can't live on their own materially. But she does recognize that lesbian relationships have been more prevalent. But Rich points out that she just kind of leaves this where it is. Why no discussion of this? What has caused lesbian relationships to be more prevalent? Have economic pressures changed? Are lesbians more visible in some way? Ultimately, she criticizes, it's assumed that lesbian sexuality needs to be explained, and actually not heterosexuality, which is somewhat surprising from feminist literature, that it's not heterosexuality or women pairing with men that needs explanation. One of the core insights of this article is to see heterosexuality as a political institution. She says, look, if women are the earliest sources of emotional caring and physical nurture for both male and female children and non-binary people, but she's not talking about that, then we should pose the question, why would women ever redirect that search towards men? Why should anything like species survival or the means of impregnation or the emotional and erotic relationship, why is that all so rigidly identified with each other? and identified with heterosexual relationships. Furthermore, why have there been such violent strictures? Why are those seen as necessary to enforce women's total emotional and erotic loyalty and subservience to men, which is what she is arguing happens in the context of heterosexual relationships? And just to get a more clear understanding of what she means by this idea of male power and the use of heterosexuality as a political institution, she just clarifies what she means here. So she thinks the power of men, or the part of having male power, includes the power to deny women sexuality. So she gives lists here that you can read on your own, or to force sexuality upon them, so generally male sexuality upon them, to command or exploit their labor to control what they produce. This has to do with childbirth and child-rearing, to control or rob them of their children, to confine them physically and to prevent their movement, to use them as objects in male transactions, so women as gifts, call girls, bunnies, geisha, and so on, to cramp their creativeness, and to withhold from them large areas of society's knowledge and cultural attainments. So you can go look at these in more detail. She gives a good list of examples for each one of them that you can go check out. One thing I will flag is that she does mention certain things like the veil here that show a particular Western or Western white, I guess, perspective that later feminism has come to terms with or has attempted to come to terms with. So some of these areas are going to be still subject to debate amongst feminists, so you shouldn't necessarily take all of the readings that at least I'm giving you as the final word on any of these subjects. To enforce this male power, women are faced with a cluster of forces, from physical brutality to control of consciousness, suggesting an enormous counterforce is having to be restrained. So this is the idea that women would not behave in these heterosexual male power serving ways without this kind of great cluster of forces. Each adds to the cluster of forces within which women have been convinced that marriage, sexual orientation towards men, that these are inevitable, even if unsatisfying or oppressive components of their lives. There's this idea that you're just supposed to take men as they are, and that is actually supposed to be a goal or a duty of being a woman. And she wants to suggest that this is not natural, right? This is a constructed orientation in this way. She also talks about how this is promoted in different institutions, like practices like pornography, practices like capitalism. So in the context of pornography, she says, look, the most pernicious message relayed by pornography is that women are naturally sexual prey to men and that they love it, that sexuality and violence are congruent, and that for women, sex is essentially masochistic, humiliation is pleasurable, and physical abuse is erotic. Gail Rubin will actually criticize some of her critiques of, or some of Rich's critiques of sadomasochistic relationships. So this is why I had this line here, and wait a second on the king shaming, and some of the resistance to pornography. And we'll get to that after looking at this piece. So there are criticisms here. But what Rich does want to point out is that generally it seems that most of the pornography produced conveys women in a particular way. Enforced submission and the use of cruelty, if within a heterosexual pairing, is sexually normal, while sensuality between women, including erotic mutuality and respect, is considered queer or sick, or even just pornographic in itself, or maybe not very exciting, not like heterosexual relationships. She wants to say that the functional purpose of pornography is really to widen the range of behavior considered acceptable from men in heterosexual intercourse. And I'm not sure if this rings true for people that have been raised around just wide access to pornography through the internet. I have a sister who is 9 years younger than me, So that puts her in Gen Z, and she has at least conveyed some kind of dismay with the kinds of things that she's expected to do for men on first dates, and that's been considered perhaps drawn from men watching a lot of pornography, which construes heterosexual expectations in a particular way. So maybe there's some truth to this. She recognizes or shows how compulsory heterosexuality plays in capitalist environments or in the workplace as one of the capitalist environments. So the fact that male employers often do not hire qualified women, even when they could pay them less, that suggests that there's more than just profit at play. So you'd think that according to a capitalist, kind of a capitalist worldview, is that, you want to cut costs, and if you can pay women less than men, then why wouldn't you hire them? So she suggests there's more than just capitalism at play. Women here are often relegated to occupy low status and low paying positions, and the sexualization of women is really a part of the job for a lot of positions. So capitalism requires that women will market sexual attractiveness to men by the kinds of clothes that they're expected to wear in the workplace, that kind of sexual harassment that they're expected to endure. And so two forces are at play for women in the workplace. Men control women's sexuality in the workplace, and capital controls the employees' work lives. So there's kind of a compounding oppression that's happening. Economically disadvantaged, women endure sexual harassment to keep their jobs and learn to behave in a complacently and ingratiatingly heterosexual manner. Those who do not play that game are called dried up, they're called sexless, they're derogatorily labeled as lesbian. And she wants to say that this is actually a pretty marked difference between the experience of gay men and gay women. So she wants to make this distinction between gay men and gay women on this grounds, that a gay woman's job depends on her pretending to be a heterosexual woman and playing the feminine deferential role in a way that maybe gay men are not expected to play. Now, it's not clear how far we can go with this analysis, but it seems, at least on its surface, to be true in the context in which she's writing, right? Gay men, of course, might be demanded to pretend as if they're straight in some way, but not in a way that services the women in the workplace or services the other men in the workplace in the way that gay women are expected to. So after all this, she wants to say, look, it seems more probable that men really fear not that they will have women's sexual appetites forced on them, or that women will want to smother and devour them. That's not the motivation behind these constraints on women's sexuality and behavior, but that women could be just indifferent to them altogether, that men could be allowed sexual and emotional, and therefore economic, access to women only on women's terms, otherwise being left on the periphery of the matrix. So the idea here is that men must be worried that women, unless we have all these constraints bearing down upon us, will not be interested in engaging with men in the way that men want to. And so we have a variety of these practices and punishments and constraints to ensure that women do so. We'll actually return to this idea when we discuss Elliot Rodger and misogyny with Kate Mann's work. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. What happens when men demand certain kinds of feminine coded goods from women and women fail to provide them or are not interested in offering them? So through this lens that she's offering, or through this idea that she's offering, heterosexuality paints sexual abuse and terrorism of women by men invisible by treating it as natural and inevitable, as just a consequence of men's sexuality and the default natural inclination that women have towards men. That's something that women should just enjoy or like, or if they're real women, that's what they'll enjoy and like. On this view, women are expendable so long as the sexual and emotional needs of men are met. And she offers this idea of sexual slavery, which she says is present in all situations where women or girls cannot change the conditions of their existence, where they are subject to sexual violence and exploitation. She gives some examples of the Minnesota pipeline, the idea that young women come from the Midwest into New York, and then they find themselves preyed upon by the city to become sex workers of some sort, to service men's sexual urges and desires. Also, the practice of sex slavery, or the purchase out of poverty in Latin America or Southeast Asia. She wants to say that part of the problem of this whole thing is compulsory sexuality. Compulsory sexuality simplifies the task of the procurer and the pimp. In the home, it leads to the daughter to accept incest and rape by her father, for the mother to deny it is happening, for the battered wife to stay with an abusive husband. And she wants to say that befriending and this kind of love, pulling on these heterosexual notions of what love means for women, is a major tactic of the procurer. In compulsory heterosexuality, there's a denial of lesbian orientation. So despite the value of women-to-women relationships and women's support networks that is common in patriarchal systems, indoctrination in male credibility and status can still create synapses in thought, denials of feeling, or wishful thinking that, the Beauty and the Beast idea, where the beast will eventually become a charming prince, a profound sexual and intellectual confusion about feelings that one might have towards other women. When we look at the measures that are designed to keep women with men, she tells us that we should ask whether the issue is really gender inequality, domination of culture by men, or taboos against homosexuality, or rather really the enforcement of heterosexuality for women as a means of assuring the male's right of physical, economic, and emotional access to women. In light of compulsory heterosexuality, lesbian existence is the breaking of a taboo and the rejection of a compulsory way of life. It's an indirect attack on the male's right to access to women. It is also an act of resistance. She wants to make distinctions here between male and female homosexuality. She wants to say that, look, women lack economic and cultural privileges. There are qualitative differences between male and female sex, though I would hazard that maybe she goes a little bit too far, and Gail Rubin picks this up as well. The more general point, though, is that lesbian experience is profoundly female for her. From the perspective of heterosexuality, these experiences are deviant, they're pathological, they're emotionally or sensually deprived, or maybe they're just considered mere lifestyles. But when we turn to the actual cases, we learn that women have always resisted male tyranny, and that's what makes it profoundly female, or if you prefer, tied to womanhood in some way. There's a distinctly feminine or woman characteristic or features about the kinds of relationships that women build together in sexual relationships and intimate relationships and emotional relationships and support networks, because women are similarly structured underneath patriarchy and male oppression. She talks as well about the medicalization and political exile of compulsory heterosexuality. Compulsory heterosexuality has been reinforced by medical institutions as well as political institutions, and we're going to read a passage which, content warning, depicts graphically a series of repeated rapes. So just want to let you know before we go into that, feel free to prepare yourself or push forward through the video if that's too much. She says, heterosexuality has been forcibly and subliminally imposed on women, yet everywhere women have resisted it, which suggests that's not a natural thing. Often at the cost of physical torture, imprisonment, psychosurgery, social ostracism, and extreme poverty. Compulsory heterosexuality was named as one of the crimes against women by the Brussels Tribunal on Crimes Against Women in 1976. Two pieces of testimony from women from two very different cultures suggests the degree to which persecution of lesbians is a global practice here and now. A report from Norway relates, a lesbian in Oslo was in a heterosexual marriage that didn't work, so she started taking tranquilizers and ended up at the Hell Sanatorium for treatment and rehabilitation. The moment she said in family group therapy that she believed she was a lesbian, the doctor told her that she was not. She knew, or he knew from, quote, looking into her eyes, he said. She had the eyes of a woman who wanted sexual intercourse with her husband, so she was subjected to so-called couch therapy. She was put in a comfortably heated room, naked, on a bed, and for an hour her husband was to try to excite her sexually. The idea was that the touching was always to end with sexual intercourse. She felt stronger and stronger aversion. She threw up and sometimes ran out of the room to avoid this, quote, treatment. The more strongly she asserted she was a lesbian, the more violent the forced heterosexual intercourse became. This treatment went on for about 6 months. She escaped from the hospital, but she was brought back. Again, she escaped. She has not been there since. In the end, she realized that she had been subjected to forcible rape for 6 months. This surely is an example of female sexual slavery according to Barry's definition. And from Mozambique, I'm condemned to live a life of exile because I will not deny that I am a lesbian, that my primary commitments are and will always be to other women. In the new Mozambique, lesbianism is considered a leftover from colonialism and decadent Western civilization. Lesbians are sent to rehabilitation camps to learn through self-criticism the correct line about themselves. If I am forced to denounce my own love for women, if I therefore denounce myself, I could go back to Mozambique and join forces in the exciting and hard struggles of rebuilding a nation, including the struggle for the emancipation of Mozambican women. As it is, I either risk the rehabilitation camps or remain in exile. These are just snippets of how different institutions can enforce compulsive heterosexuality. So many lesbian women have then stayed in heterosexual relationships because of economic survival, because of care for children, to remain respectable, to desire to feel normal, because heterosexual relationships were represented as the female adventure, or the woman's duty and fulfillment. In conclusion, compulsive heterosexuality functions as a denial of women's access to other women, denies access to a source of feminine power. It reduces women's ability to change social relations of the sexes. She thinks that, and she shows that, it arises in feminist scholarship, in every profession, every reference work, every curriculum, every organizing attempt, etc. It keeps women trapped into a sexuality that doesn't necessarily fit them. It perpetuates the idea that women need men as social and economic protectors for sexuality and for psychological completion. Heterosexuality constitutes society's basic social unit. Those who do not submit are ostracized or othered. Lesbian existence is not just a refuge from male abuses. She says it's an electric and empowering charge between women. It is a liberating force for women. We need to understand heterosexuality as an institution that has been organized and maintained for the specific purpose of tailoring women to men's desires. We're going to finish with some reading from the last bits of her. And here is some of the liberatory feminist possibilities for studying lesbian existence in more detail. The work that lies ahead of unearthing and describing what I call here lesbian existence is potentially liberating for all women. It is work that must assuredly move beyond the limits of white and middle-class Western women's studies to examine women's lives, work, and groupings within every racial, ethnic, and political structure. There are differences, moreover, between lesbian existence and the lesbian continuum, differences we can discern even in the movement of our own lives. The lesbian continuum, I suggest, needs delineation in light of the double life of women, not only women self-described as heterosexual, but also of self-described lesbians. We need a far more exhaustive account of the forms the double life has assumed. Historians need to ask at every point how heterosexuality as institution has been organized and maintained through the female wage scale, the enforcement of middle-class women's leisure, the glamorization of so-called sexual liberation, the withholding of education from women, the imagery of high art and popular culture, the mystification of the personal sphere, and much else. We need an economics which comprehends the institution of heterosexuality, with its doubled workload for women and its sexual divisions of labor, as the most idealized of economic relations. And the question will inevitably rise, are we then to condemn all heterosexual relationships, including those which are least oppressive? I believe this question, though often heartfelt, is the wrong question here. We have been stalled in a maze of false dichotomies, which prevents our apprehending the institution as a whole. Good versus bad marriages, marriage for love versus arranged marriage, liberated sex versus prostitution, heterosexual intercourse versus rape, Liebesschmerz versus humiliation and dependency. Within the institution exist, of course, qualitative differences of experience, but the absence of choice remains the great unacknowledged reality. And in the absence of choice, women will remain dependent upon the chance or luck of particular relationships and will have no collective power and determine the meaning and place of sexuality in their lives. As we address the institution itself, moreover, we begin to perceive a history of female resistance which has never fully understood itself because it has been so fragmented, miscalled, and erased. It will require a courageous grasp of the politics and economics, as well as the cultural propaganda of heterosexuality, to carry us beyond individual cases or diversified group situations into the complex kind of overview needed to undo the power men everywhere wield over women, power which has become a model for every other form of exploitation and illegitimate control.